All right, so we are at the top of the hour. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Laura Stewart. I'm joined here by my colleague Ken Kirby, who I'll introduce later on in the webinar. And we're here to talk about professional learning in 2025, essential insights for educational leaders. My name is Laura Stewart, and you can read about me here. But really, I think the most important thing that you want to know about me is that I'm a lifelong educator. I've been in education for a long time. And I'm actually really committed to and passionate about early literacy. I've been very fortunate to be able to work in schools and districts and organizations really around that. And I want to continue to contribute in the best way I can to ensure that all children learn to read so that they can be literate citizens of the 21st century. And I'm guessing everybody that is joining us here, and again, thank you for being here, shares that mission with me, or you wouldn't be doing the work you're doing. And I really appreciate that mission and the work that you do every day. We've got a lot of people here, lots of different roles, different parts of the country. And again, you are so appreciated. It's really an honor to be able to support you in your important work. So, as I said before, the title of this is Professional Learning in 2025. So, we're really going to think about and explore these ideas. We're going to think about what leadership strategies can really drive effective literacy instruction and think about what we know about professional learning that's engaging and impactful and sustainable. So, this is really an exploration, and I'm delighted to be able to offer questions that we can ponder as leaders around designing effective professional learning, and also share some recent research around professional learning. And I'm also really, really delighted to have a courageous leader joining us today, Ken Kirby, who will also talk about his wisdom and experience in designing professional learning. So lots to do. The content for the webinar today is taken from this ebook, The Courage to Lead. And this book is a book that I wrote basically as a way to elevate leadership and to make sure that we understand the importance of leadership in driving transformational change in literacy. So you can use this QR code to download the ebook. Also, we're going to put the link. You'll see it in the attendee chat. There's a link to this book. Really, what this book was designed to do is introduce you to the implementation science and the phases of implementation and what leadership moves are necessary as we implement change. There's also sections on cultural responsiveness and words of wisdom from other courageous leaders around the country, profiles of school districts that have made transformational change in literacy. So I think you'll find this a valuable resource in terms of leading literacy. I think there's something very special about leadership in literacy and very important. Ken and I will be talking to you about that today. And the implementation science, which of course I think is a game changer when we think about leadership. And today we'll be focused on one aspect of leadership, which is that professional learning. So in the Courage to Lead ebook, I define a courageous leader this way. Go ahead and read this to yourself. Go ahead and read these bullet points to yourself. So when we think about, ensuring all students become readers and writers, a vision of transformation, a culture, all of that is supported by professional learning. So everything we do as leaders can really be supported and actualized through professional learning. Now, why is professional learning so critical? Well, I like to say this: we have unfinished work around literacy. As a literacy leader, you know that all means all. And if all your students aren't to experience success in learning to read and write, then we have unfinished work. And to be honest, unfortunately, not all of our teachers are entering the profession with strong preparation in evidence-aligned principles of teaching and learning. So we need to make up for that with strong professional learning. One thing I want to say, though, and I like to emphasize this, is there's no shame, there's no blame. We have unfinished work around literacy, and we need to engage in that work together. And also, I just want to make sure, I am using the term professional learning rather than professional development, because I really think about how we want to ensure that learning growth is what we're focused on, and the growth that continues as educators. We continue to learn and grow throughout our profession. So when I think about transformational change in literacy, there are sciences that drive that transformational change. We tend to think about the science of reading, but it's really important that we also pay attention to the sciences of teaching and learning and the implementation science. So as leaders, when you're designing professional learning, I want you to take these all into consideration. So we're just going to have some time to examine each of those. So let's talk about the science of reading. Key principles around the science of reading. We know a lot about how children learn to read. We know what happens when things go wrong. We know what instruction needs to look like. So to summarize some evidence-aligned instruction around the science of reading, first, instruction that is explicit and systematic. 2, cumulative review for the consolidation of learning. We know that review is really important to attach the new to the known. A third factor in the science of reading instruction is making sure that we're providing sequential instruction from least complex to most complex concepts and skills. A fourth principle of the science of reading is that we have active engagement, and specifically that as we're teaching children foundational skills in reading, that we're applying those skills in authentic reading and writing. A fourth principle of instruction around the science of reading is that our instruction is data-driven, that we're looking at how do we differentiate instruction, how do we provide intervention, how do we provide enrichment. We can find those answers by looking at the data. And finally, this is the one that many people are curious about, coherence and alignment across all tiers of instruction. So let me unpack that a little bit for you. So when you think about instructional methodology and instructional resources, you want to make sure that there is a coherence across grades and across tiers of instruction. So your tier 1 core, your tier 2 intervention, your tier 3 intensive intervention across K-5 needs to be aligned. So here's ways that we want to think about alignment. 1, alignment in academic language. There's a consistency of academic language. I'm going to give you a very specific example. It was shared with me. A first grade teacher said, okay, in tier 1 core, we teach the kids about the long vowel silent E pattern. But in intervention, they use the term magic E. And a first grader doesn't necessarily know that that's the same thing, right? So that consistent academic language. Alignment in terms of focused instruction, making sure that scope and sequence of skills is the same across tiers and the same across grades, so that kids are getting additive, not replacement instruction. And that the routines, the high quality, high impact routines, for example, that lessons have an I do, we do, you do format, or high impact routines like sound spelling mapping and word chaining, that those routines are consistent so that kids can hit the ground running and not have to spend their cognitive energy on process. They could spend their cognitive energy on the learning. That efficiency, those routines are also helpful for us as teachers, because we know what to expect in the lesson and we can focus on student response and making those instructional moves, because the consistency of the lesson is helpful for us as well. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the data alignment connects instruction across all tiers by pinpointing our student needs, informing our grouping, and providing visibility. Data should be something that we can see as teachers, but that can also be visible to administration, district level, et cetera, so that we can see the big picture as well as the granular picture of each student. So those are attributes that we would call, aligned to the science of reading. What about learning science? What about aligning to the science of learning? Well, let me share with you. This is from Deans for Impact. And you might be familiar with this organization. If not, I encourage you to check them out. The website is listed here on the slide. Here's the evidence-aligned learning science principles. We've learned a lot from the learning sciences, and here's some ideas. First of all, we know that students learn new ideas by references to ideas they already know. That's just how we learn. And so one of the practices that we want to ensure that we are supporting in professional learning is review, making sure that our teachers are using instructional practices that allow for review. Number two, managing the learning load. You're probably very familiar with this idea of cognitive load and how learning can be impeded if we're sending our kids too much information. And that's why that sequential instruction, that's why the gradual release, I do, we do, you do. That's why those repeatable, replicable routines are so important, because we're not overloading our students cognitively. That's a principle taken from learning science. Another principle from learning science is that students need to think about meaning. That's the whole purpose. Like, we always want to make sure that we're focusing our lessons and making sure kids know what to pay attention to, and that those skills, for example, are serving reading and writing. Those skills are serving the application. Another learning science principle is practicing with a purpose. We want guided practice. We want our students to have independent practice. And we want our students to also have interleaved practice. And interleaved practice is simply mixing up practice from different concepts rather than just focusing on one concept. For example, if our students are practicing word accuracy and automaticity at the word level, accuracy and automaticity at the word level, that we practice reading words of the pattern that we're teaching them, but we also bring in some previously mastered patterns. So that interleaved practice allows our students to practice, again, the new and the known. Another principle from the learning science is making sure we give our kids feedback, that we have feedback loops built into an I do, we do, you do supported model. And finally, motivation. How do we create a motivating environment? That's the work of you all in your classrooms, is to help your kids feel safe and supported and valued. But I would also argue that motivation comes through success. So giving our students the right instruction, the right practice, and the right support will allow them to be successful. And when they experience those incremental steps of success, that will help them continue to feel motivated and to persevere with their learning. So the third science I wanted to share with you that is also underscores professional learning is the implementation science. And what is the implementation science? It is the scientific study of methods that promote an uptake of research into practice. So implementation science is really that bridge between research and practice. And why this is so important is the research around the implementation science. It's quite a deep field of research, and I think many of us in education have not been availed to this research in the past. But one thing we know is that if we do not have implementation teams and a clear implementation plan, it can take 17 years to move half of a new initiative into practice. Wow. Okay, I don't know about you, but I don't have 17 years to move the needle. Ken, do you have 17 years to move the needle? I just don't think we do. So what we know from the implementation science, if you have a positive implementation plan, a well thought out implementation plan, and implementation teams, you can reach your outcomes, 80% of your outcomes, in 3 years, which is much more doable. Now, I go into a lot more detail about the implementation science in the Courage to Lead book, but this will give you some basic ideas to work with as you think about professional learning. So I'm going to share this equation with you, and I think this is a really good way to show the impact of implementation science. So this equation looks a lot like the simple view of reading, for those of you familiar with the simple view of reading, in that it's multiplicative. Each of these factors ends up contributing to a result. So let's think about, what do we want? What do we want? Well, we want, our end goal would be educational equity, literacy for all. That's what we want. What factors contribute to that? Well, the first factor is effective practice, and that is understanding evidence-aligned instruction, those principles I just shared with you around the science of reading. Secondly, effective implementation. How do we provide support for that practice? And thirdly, enabling contexts. All this means is what's the environment, what's the setting in which we are operating that will maximize our results. Now, let me get a little more granular for you here. So, effective practice, evidence-aligned instruction, again, that's those principles of instruction that I shared with you previously, but also effective resources. You have to have good materials in teachers' hands to actualize this. Effective implementation is the implementation teams, the systems, the professional learning, ongoing coaching to support the instructional methodology and the resources. And finally, enabling context. Literacy leadership is a huge part of creating a context for success. Now, why is this a multiplicative equation? Well, let me put some numbers behind this for you. I'm going to make up a school. We are school, ABC. Well, in school ABC, do we have effective practice in place? We do. We've learned about the science of reading. We have some good instructional protocols in place. However, we're still using some of our old methodology left over from our, whole language years. So I'm going to give us an 80% compliance on effective practice. In school ABC, yes, we have professional learning, but coaching's too expensive, so we're not going to invest in that. So I'm going to give us a 50% compliance on effective implementation. And in school ABC, we've got literacy leadership, but we also have a lot of turnover. And so we're not consistent across our entire school, our entire district. So I'm going to give us about a 60% compliance on enabling context. Well, do the math, and you'll see that results in us having about a 24% chance of effectively meeting our outcomes. So I share this with you to say, yikes, we have to be all in. We have to be all in. And the implementation science can help provide a roadmap for being all in. So here's where professional learning is really critical. It's a critical factor in this entire equation of reaching our outcomes. So what works in professional learning? There's actually been quite a bit of research around professional learning, and that's good to know. Linda Darling-Hammond and her colleagues did a study about what makes professional learning effective. To change teaching practice and improve student outcomes, professional learning has to have these attributes. We have to have a focused content. What are we learning about? Active learning. Collaboration. We want to have time for us as educators to collaborate together. Modeling of effective practice. We can't just talk about it. We have to see it. Having a coach at our side to support us, critical factor. And professional learning needs to be sustained. Many times I ask, when I'm working in a school or in a district, I'll ask them, what's getting in the way of you achieving your goals in professional learning? And many times they say, we're changing all the time. We're doing this initiative, then that initiative, then this initiative. I would argue that we have to make literacy a focus and sustain that professional learning over time for everyone, because everyone's a reading teacher, number one. And number two, if we don't get literacy right, we don't get anything right. So in the book, in the Courage to Lead book, I do provide you with a professional learning checklist to think about as leaders or as advocates for your leaders in your buildings and districts, because we want to build a culture of curiosity and learning. That's what we want to do in professional learning. So we think about, are we providing professional learning that focuses on evidence-aligned principles of instruction, right? Are we ensuring that we are presenting and supporting relevant, culturally relevant and current research and practice? Are we including coaching? Is there professional learning for everybody? Because as I said before, every teacher is a reading teacher. Is it ongoing and long-term? Do we have professional learning communities? And as a leader, do you yourself know about the science of reading and about the science of learning? Ken and I were talking about this earlier. As a leader, you don't need to know as deeply as your reading specialists need to know, for example, but you need to know enough so that you can really support those initiatives. I'm sure many of you watching today are familiar with the Joyce and Showers research, which I'm showing you 2002, but it's been replicated. The big takeaway here is think about professional development or professional learning outcomes. If you structure professional learning that is just theory, just somebody presenting content, your teachers will increase their knowledge level somewhat, but there's really not a lot of carryover to practice. If you experience professional learning as a demonstration, a modeling, that's important. It's important, don't get me wrong, but again, not a lot of carryover to practice. If in your professional development setting or professional learning setting, participants are practicing, okay, a little bit more. But look at where coaching is the cumulative impact of theory, demonstration, practicing, and coaching. You can really see the transfer of 95% of that content is going to transfer to practice. So again, going back to the implementation science and that equation, coaching is a critical part of professional learning. Now, the big question we always have to ask ourselves is, okay, professional learning, great, but does it impact student outcomes? That is the million-dollar question. Because while we want to increase our student knowledge, we also want to make sure that that knowledge is somehow impacting student outcomes. So there have been several studies, you see these studies here, that link knowledge to student outcomes. However, I want you to note the bold type here is that it's best achieved when the implementation is supported by coaching. I can't emphasize that enough. And I'm excited to point to a relatively new paper that was published in the International Journal of Instruction. And in this particular paper, what they did is they looked at professional development and coaching in the science of reading. And they looked at a study, or they did a study that showed, does teachers' knowledge of the science of reading impact oral reading fluency? Now, why? And by the way, this was a 5-year professional learning project, and this study was done by 2 professors at SUNY Oswego and a researcher from East Carolina University, 5 years. And why did they study impact on ORF, oral reading fluency? Well, just as a refresher for oral reading fluency, it's the ability to read text aloud, accurately, automatically, and with prosody. And it is a measure of reading success. Over and over, we see the causal effect of oral reading fluency as an overall gauge of reading proficiency. And what happens when you give a kid oral reading fluency assessment for accuracy and rate, you get a words correct per minute score. And that words correct per minute score has 30 years of validation research, again, indicating that it's a robust indicator of overall reading development. So that's why these researchers took a look at professional learning's impact on oral reading fluency. And here's what they found. They found that across this 5-year quasi-experimental study, the sample demonstrated greater growth when compared to national norms. So the students whose teachers received this professional learning in the science of reading had stronger ORF scores. So what they found is that it is professional development, but it's also ongoing coaching that really makes a difference in students, the impact of students' oral reading fluency. So the implications support science of reading as an effective instructional framework. And what they also found, this was quite an interesting little side benefit that they discovered, is that science of reading aligned instruction can mitigate against the loss of instructional classrooms, time in classrooms, and serve as a protective factor against school interruptions, especially for at-risk learners. And the reason they found that out is because this study took place partly during the pandemic. So here's what the lead researcher said. We attributed the expedited ORF growth observed in the study to the perpetual, intentional, and recursive science of reading professional learning, and from that, the subsequent shifting of teaching practices. That's the key. And how were those shifts in teaching practices achieved? Through coaching, right? So again, it's that coaching that is really critical. So I'm going to give you a moment just to read these quotes around professional learning and coaching. Just give you a moment to read this. And I do want to bring up something that I do mention in the Courage to Lead. And again, when you download this book, you'll see it. It's about differentiated professional learning. Thinking about as we, when we differentiate learning for our students, are we also differentiating learning for professional learning? Because when you think about what do we need to know as classroom gen ed teachers, what do we need to know as interventionists, what do we need to know as coaches who support teachers, what do we need to know as administrators? So there's a through line of the science of reading, there's a through line of the science of learning, there's a through line of implementation science, but what level of depth is required for all of the players in our schools and districts? All right, so with that background in mind, I'm delighted to welcome Ken into the conversation. And also just to remind you all, as you listen to our conversation, feel free to drop some questions in the little question box. So I'll introduce Ken to you, and then we'll just have some time with Ken. So Ken is a passionate educator. And I've known Ken for a while, and I can say that's so true. So Ken began his career as a kindergarten teacher before serving as a building level Alabama Reading First coach. For all of us who remembers the Reading First years. Later, as a regional literacy specialist with the Alabama Reading Initiative, he supported multiple districts in Northeast Alabama. And in 2017, as a K-12 school improvement specialist in Marshall County Schools, he supported reading, math, science, and overall school improvement initiatives across 12 schools. Ken has recently supported 60 K-3 schools across North Central Alabama as a regional literacy leadership specialist for 9 school districts, managing elementary curriculum, assessment, science of reading implementation, student-centered coaching, and impactful processes supporting the MTSS framework. That's a big job, Ken. You've got a big job.
Yeah. When you read that, I'm just shocked to hear all of those things.
Yeah, it is great.
Happy to be here, Laura, though. Happy to be here. Excited.
Thank you. And Ken and I met because in his work in Marshall County, they used 95% group materials and professional learning. And so that's how we got to know each other a few years ago. So Ken, tell us about your experiences both in your former role at Marshall County and also in your current role in designing professional learning for educators.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think a lot of similarities over my career. When I first started out, my primary client was I supported both classroom teachers across K-3. That was the targeted grade levels, and still remains those targeted grade levels in my current work. I supported literacy specialists in all the schools, so reading coaches at that time. We had reading coaches in all of the schools in Alabama back in the early 2000s, and that was an amazing experience. I learned so much, and in terms of thinking about professional development planning, it always came back to data. Everything begins with that. I will say too that of course quantitative is always the first place we lean into, but over time I've seen more and more value in also trying to balance out that qualitative aspect. What teachers are excited to learn about, what their background is, and how much professional development they've previously had, their science of reading, professional learning experiences, etc. So that was always been my main driver, I guess, if you will, in designing professional learning. In terms of when I began working as a K-12 school improvement specialist, it was definitely still that, but it kind of had to expand more so because I was kind of intertwined in a lot of different content areas. So that was where, I supported both principals, reading specialists, teachers. I was a support for all three of those entities, and not necessarily just general ed classroom teachers, but also special ed, EL, pre-K, you name it. Anybody that really could be impacted, of course, and played a major role in supporting students' literacy growth. I tried to be a part of the professional learning goals for those different groups of educators. Anything from thinking about just as simple as working with administrators on conducting walkthroughs and taking those next steps in order to target professional learning, whether it be something large scale or small scale. District-wide initiatives, absolutely. There were things that were kind of driven from a State Department standpoint, of course, but then also the freedom within our district to look at our data and know what it was that our schools and our administrators and our teachers and students needed to. So we had to take all of that into account. Thinking about what I'm doing now, um, working with administrators primarily, those are my main clients now. I have around 60 schools and various backgrounds of administrators, various backgrounds of schools and needs. I work with high need schools to high performing schools. And so everything again comes back to data. But what I really try to do is I work with district leadership and then also principals to try to identify trends. We try to look at, what data is
Mhm.
something that we can say is not a one-off, right? But something that rather has been persistent. And then we try to then align that to what would be a logical professional learning timeline, a logical professional learning approach in order to be able to equip whether it's a grade level or a grade span or an entire school or an entire district leadership team. So it can vary
Mhm.
depending on what the goal is based on those trends. Heavily involved in a lot of MTSS focused professional learning. A lot of what I do that I really try to sink my teeth into problem solving team processes, overall MTSS supports in schools. I think you learn so much. Just yesterday I was at a school, I had a chance to sit in half a day in their problem solving team, their MTSS meetings. And I complimented them at the end of it. I said, one of the things that I'm going to take away from this today is just how well you know your students. There was a group of
Mhm.
about 7 or 8 educators in that room, principal included, and it was just very heartwarming to know that they knew not only about those students' data when it comes to reading, but they also knew about all of those other things that if you can, reflect back, and I'm sure all of us have seen the iceberg analogy and all of the things that are under the surface. And so it was awesome to be able to see that. So, MTSS aligned professional learning, and then everything for me centers around the science of reading. I did
Yeah.
dabble in the math and the science areas, for a while there, and it was a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I held my own, in some ways. But the reading realm is kind of where I hang my hat.
Well, I think you and I both agree on that. That really is our most fundamental, goal is making sure that we ensure literacy for all of our students. I wanted to go back to what you said about MTSS, and I've heard this over and over again for in schools where they finally implement a really solid multi-tiered systems of support for their students when they get into those data dives and get into their problem solving groups, that they really start to see their students as our students, not Ms. Stewart students and Mr. Kirby students and whatnot. It's just our students. Have you seen that as well?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of times we have, just some misconceptions about who needs to be on that team. You'll have schools that'll have different teams, like you might have a math school improvement team in a school, or you might have a reading school improvement team. You have an MTSS team. And the individuals that you pick for that team to be involved in that matter. You need to make sure that you've got the people at the table that touch students. For instance, in the meeting I was in yesterday, you had EL teacher, you had special ed teacher that was in that room, you had interventionist, AP, principal, reading specialist, plus
Mhm,
the
mhm.
classroom teachers that were involved in it too. And I
Yeah.
think that it's pivotal to be able to really rally everybody around that and not treat it as though that it's just something that happens in a closed off space and it's
Mhm,
only for
mhm.
certain people. And we're not going to talk about this, in other realms of the school day, but it needs to really be that key driver. That's what I see in schools that that make the greatest growth in the fastest time, they have an effective MTSS process in place.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that collaborative problem solving, like that is really that's really the game changer when it comes to MTSS and access to that data. I mentioned
Right.
that, making sure that the data is visible to all invested parties is really a critical piece of that. Yeah,
Saw that yesterday. It's gotta be visible, you gotta be as transparent as you can, you
mhm,
want people to have access to things very quickly and easily, and now with all of the technology and digital, opportunities we have,
yeah,
there's really no excuse not to have that type of data right there at your fingertips for everybody
that's
involved.
right. That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. So Ken, when you think about, professional learning, how important is building knowledge? Like you mentioned scientifically, how important is just building that knowledge base?
Well, to say it's critical is probably an understatement. I like to think of it as kinda like that bedrock that all of our skyscrapers of literacy are built on top of. We can continue to firm up that foundation, of course, over time, like just being continual lifelong learners, right? Never stop learning, never stop trying to engage in different professional learning opportunities to learn more and more and make connections. As it relates to good quality professional learning and what teachers can really walk away from that with, and also administrators too, right? We
Mhm.
don't leave those out. We know that the importance of really supporting them and building knowledge. But I think the more you know, the better you can make connections to your curriculum, the better you can be a better consumer of your curriculum and your resources, the more you can question effectively of what you're teaching, how you're teaching it, the standards that are involved in your instruction, and how you want to assess those standards. And just overall, the more knowledge you have, it's going to increase your effectiveness if, and that, this is my if, and it comes back to what you already mentioned about the opportunity for coaching, the opportunity to be able to develop your skill set. I tell people all the time that I can teach you the why, okay, but the how is something that you're going to have to be open to learning, whether that's learning with a specialist, whether that's learning with a peer. And I know somebody in the question box that we have here asked if teachers could be coaches, and the answer to that is 100% yes. When you think about the Joyce and Showers research, a lot of those underpinnings to that research is revolving around peer coaching, and so teachers being able to coach with one another, 100%. I think that I've seen opportunities where you've had not leadership labs, but learning labs or lesson studies where teachers come together to analyze lessons and then implement that and reflect on how students performed, sort student work. It's some of the best professional development you can do, and it really doesn't cost much at all, and it's under your roof. It's professional learning that can take place in your building.
Yes, and I think that's, again, why I like to use the term professional learning, because it's just ongoing learning that leads to your, I would even call it personal growth. I mean, it's professional, but it's also just like a personal growth path that you have. And I think, when you talk about collaboration, like PLCs, well run, well organized PLCs, but we as leaders don't necessarily have to, mastermind all that. I mean, like you said, we've got a lot of expertise in our buildings that allow teachers to be supportive and coaching with other teachers. I have to say, one of the most powerful tools we have that's right there under our roofs is being able to give our teachers some release time to go and observe another teacher teach a lesson, and then to have
100%.
time afterwards to reflect and say, okay, what aspects of this were big aha moments for us? What aspects of this would we do differently? Or what aspects of this can we fine tune? I mean, I think that's just a powerful model. And now, of course, to do that, we all have to be vulnerable and open, but that's part of building a culture of continuous learning and curiosity, which I think is, you mentioned that, right? Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's part of getting to that 95%. Those
Mhm.
percentages in the Joyce and Showers, those are cumulative. So you need the
Right.
theory, you need the
Yes.
model, you need the practice, and you need the coaching. You need all of those in order to get to that 95% transfer. And so I
Yes.
love that, that you mentioned about being able to have, we used to call those buddy visits, to where
Mhm,
we
mhm.
would have teachers and free them up. PLCs are a great way. And, I'll close this point by just saying that, you know, engaging in professional learning experiences can definitely build knowledge, but I'm a firm believer, and I know you are too, that we also build knowledge in doing. So the doing matters. So
Mhm.
as I practice these tasks, or as I work with other teachers in practicing these strategies or the routines in order to perfect my teaching, I'm building knowledge in that manner too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's another key thing. So talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned the iceberg, or I was talking earlier about, how much teachers need to know versus administrators. Talk to me a little bit about that, like the differentiation of the professional learning.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'll say that, one thing, and I think it was something that struck me not too long ago. I was in a district and we were talking about how we were going to design and set up some professional learning for teachers. And sometimes we get too much tunnel vision when it comes to that. We have to kind of get outside of the box. Like we'll think, well, let's design this professional learning, and our target audience is going to be the teachers that teach our students in a general ed setting. Whether they're
Yeah. Yeah.
self-contained or departmentalized. But I know, like even in our group today in the webinar, we have special ed teachers, we have pre-K, we have ed tech. I think good leaders know how to pull those other entities in. And that comes back to your slide that showed the importance of being able to have that consistent language, consistent routines, consistent strategies, consistent way that we assess. When you can pull those other entities in and not get too confined into thinking that this PD is only for this group of teachers, I think you can really start to maximize and accelerate. And administrators included in that too, right? Always trying to include administrators. They're busy. We know. So you got to be very conscious about how you work with them in order to make sure that they have some time freed up to do it. But I've just seen such a benefit in being able to have our collaborative teachers, our EL teachers, our pre-K teachers engage
Yeah.
in science and reading, professional learning. It just gives that common message that now you can have things get aligned much more quickly in your school.
Isn't that in that alignment could not be more important. Did you listen to or read the latest Emily Hanford APM report?
I have it saved.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, for our audience today, if you're not familiar with Emily Hanford's APM reporting, American Public Meeting reporting, she's been reporting on education, literacy in particular, for several years now. And her series "Sold a Story" was highly impactful. And she just released this week, or was it last week, her latest episode, and it was really profiling a a district in Steubenville, Ohio, and how they've been able to meet that goal of having all their students reading. And we know one of the reasons we're called 95% group, by the way, is because the data is clear that with the right instruction, we 95% or more of our students can learn to read. And so Emily Hanford profiled this district in Steubenville, Ohio, where they're achieving that goal of teaching all kids to read. And one of the things that came clear to me in the reporting was one of the factors, when we think about those success factors, one of the factors was it was all hands on deck. And in their MTSS model, they use a walk to read methodology where all kids, by looking at the data, all kids are getting what they need based on the data, and they walk to their reading group. And everybody's on deck. So everybody has a reading group. Every teacher has a reading group, even, the gym teacher and the counselor and the social, that everybody has a reading group. And so, talking about utilizing data and giving kids what they need within a shared space of our kids, that's like, to me, a wonderful example that impacts student outcome. To
Yeah,
be able
it's
to
funny.
do that. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
No, no, it's funny you say that because yesterday, this will put a smile on your face, but I actually shared Success Factor 3 from Susan Hall's book, The 10
Oh,
Success
yeah.
Factors for Literacy
Yes.
Intervention, which is or things you need to consider if you're implementing a walked intervention model. So,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
that was just yesterday.
And thanks for giving a shout out to that book. That's a great book. At 95% Group, our founder, Susan Hall, wrote a book, 10 Success Factors. And it's really all about, utilizing MTSS and specifically for intervention, but utilizing MTSS and thinking about what are the 10 things you've got to cross check yourself to make sure that are in place so that your MTSS can be really successful. Somebody asked in the question, question box, does 95% group have a fidelity tool for schools to use around evidence-aligned instruction? So I'm going to give you my email and you can email me about this, but I will say that, one of the things that I would really check out is, again, this Courage to Lead book that we gave you access to, because this has a lot of information about what we need to look for. We at 95% Group, yes, if you're using our resources, we have, walkthrough documents, and we have, best practices documents. But if you're looking at just in general, the other book that I would encourage you is another book that we published. It was called The Science of Reading 2.0. And this is also a good book to look at what are evidence-aligned principles of instruction that we need to be utilizing to make sure that we're getting the best impact, both from instruction and also from resources. And Ken, maybe you can talk about this. How important are both? Like, how important is it that we provide professional learning in instruction, but then also that we have the right resources in teachers' hands?
Yeah, 100%. They have to be aligned, right? We know that the why matters. We know that how we teach and, our effectiveness in providing explicit instruction is critical. But you need a good what. Your curriculum is going to be something that is going to be a key driver towards not only student success, but also teacher efficacy along the way. And I can't say it as eloquently. I've heard Kareem Weaver speak a few times. And Kareem's really big about talking about how we really need curriculums that lighten that cognitive load for teachers. We don't need curriculums that are complicated or overcomplicated.
Yes,
And so
yes.
I'm a huge advocate for really trying to put the things in teachers' hands that make their life easy, but those things have to be grounded in solid, evidence-based,
Mhm.
and tied to the science of reading. So yeah,
Yeah.
it matters. Can't put a price on what high quality instructional materials play a role. Absolutely.
Yeah. I go back to that slide we showed earlier that showed the alignment, in all those different ways. I think that alignment checklist, if you will, is really important when we think about resources. Like, we want our kids that are in core to have the same instruction, but at a deeper, more intensive level in intervention. But it really has to follow that same skills backbone. And so that our kids are getting additive instruction, not replacement instruction. So a good curricula that ensures that there is alignment across grades and across tiers, to me is really a critical tool that teachers use. We're building their knowledge, we're building their practice, and we're giving them the tools to enact all of that.
That's what I was going to say when you mentioned, across all tiers. I also kind of would add to that, here's an example. Like, we trained all of our special ed teachers in, dyslexia awareness. We also took advantages of training our SPED and EL teachers in foundational dyslexia specific interventions. That just
Mm,
equipped them even more, because those were the same interventions that were being utilized with students who didn't have an IELP or didn't have an IEP. So we ensured that the best interventions were available to all students,
all
not just
students.
a select group of students, right?
That's
And
Yep, yep. And that goes back to data, doesn't it, Ken?
right, absolutely. It goes back to the
And
alignment process that you mentioned, and I'll
mhm,
just say too that for good administrators, for leaders out there, empower and build good teams in order to make very conscious, deliberate selection on the material so that you can increase that alignment opportunity. And if you're a teacher, in whatever capacity, build knowledge and then advocate to be a part of those teams that are engaged in selecting of those materials.
I love that. Yeah, yes, exactly. Because we need all the voices, right? But we need the informed voices to come to the table for that. Yeah. So, Ken, a couple more questions before we wrap up. In your experience, how has professional learning impacted student achievement?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you, and I know me and you have talked about this before, but when I first came to Marshall County as a K-12 school improvement specialist, looking at the data, what we noticed is that we had, well, let's just say our data was suboptimal in a lot of different areas. Not
Yeah.
just if you think about Scarborough's Road, you think about those different areas of literacy that are critical to becoming a skilled reader. we had gaps in all of those. Of course, what
Mhm.
we know is that if we did not, we knew at that time that if we did not tackle those word recognition issues first and foremost, then it was not going to have a large impact on our ability for
Mhm.
students to be critical thinkers and develop language, etc. And so that was one of the things that I really, hinged on, and starting with the root cause. It's just a root cause analysis. Where's our issue at, and how can we attack it? And then so designing professional development that focused on that, not getting dissuaded, not getting sidetracked, but working the plan, work the plan, develop momentum with that. Start small, let it grow, put the right people in place, make it public. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
Make it public with as much as we have going on now with social media, the ability to be able to show what can be done to help students with some of this new approach that was very new to us at that time, because we went full bore into all of our teachers being trained in Orton Gillingham strategies,
Mm.
implementing across all
Mhm.
classrooms across K-3. We put those in place across tier 2 and tier 3 as well. And so what we started to see, and it took us about 3 years to really start to see that jump, but after
Mhm.
that third year, we were much improved in those foundational skills. We still had gaps when it came to comprehension. We still had gaps when it came to,
Mhm.
anything
Mhm.
involving critical thinking. But our ORF, our ability to read at the word level, our phonemic awareness, proficiency, all of those things grew. So we knew at that point in time, now we had built that sustainability in those grade levels,
Mhm.
that now we could kind of shift gears and start to look towards how we could develop teachers more professionally in that other part of the road. So we just had to. It was
Yeah.
tough. I mean, I won't say it was easy. For me, I'm very concrete sequential. I like to move slow, and people kind of, that's one of my pitfalls. Maybe I'll move a little bit too deliberately, but I don't like to make missteps. I don't like to have to go back and try
Mhm.
to fix
Mhm.
something. I don't like to try to have things become messy. And so I think the time that you put in up front, and the way that you work that plan, understanding that it's not going to be an overnight process. You didn't come to this spot data wise overnight, and you're not going to dig yourself out of it overnight. And so you
Yes.
just have to be humble with that, and you have to continue to message that, and you need the people around you to be able to message that too.
I love that. Well, you just right there, you encapsulated so many great words of wisdom. First of all, you know, um, plan the work and then work the plan, right? Plan the work, then work the plan. Make sure that you know that this is a long-term process. This isn't an overnight thing. One thing that we emphasize in the Courage to Read book is that the implementation science is really clear on this, that an initiative, a successful initiative, can take 3 to 5 years or longer, and have courageous conversations. Like, you had to have some courageous conversations around data to really just get the plan in place. We have a couple comments here, and then I know we need to wrap it up. Empowering teachers with appropriate knowledge will change classroom practice. That's where it all begins. Um, do you have any material we can read from this? Yes, Jennifer. Please check out the links that we put in the chat to the 2 books that I mentioned earlier, The Science of Reading 2.0 and The Courage to Lead. I think that will give you some good places to start in terms of reflecting on the content that we've talked about today. In wrapping this up, one of the things, Ken, that I think you've alluded to too, is that as leaders, we have to always be asking ourselves questions. We have to be self-reflective. We have to say, are we seeing the change? Do we have the right teams? Are we getting the data we need? Do we have the right instructional materials? And is the professional learning, coaching, and mentoring having the effects that we want? So being constantly self-reflective is part of this whole process of designing professional learning, but also the bigger process of implementing transformative change. Um, I also love this, teaching all of us here today on this webinar. We are fortunate to be part of a career, a profession. I know in my own career, I have been very thankful that we are a profession of continual inquiry. We are a profession of expanding repertoire and continuing to do better at what we do. And I think that's a lot of what professional learning is all about, is making sure that we're supporting and building on that curiosity and inquiry. So as we wrap up today, just think to yourself, what resonated with you? What questions do you have? What are your next best steps in whatever role that you play? And as Ken said, we've got lots of different roles of represented today. And we thank you all for taking your busy time out of your busy day to join us today and really think about, is there anything today that affirmed what you do? Anything today that piqued your curiosity? Do you have some next steps? And thank you for all you do each day. Ken and I were at a conference. No, you didn't go to Plain Talk. I was at Plain Talk last week, and there was a guest speaker. And the best speaker said, we don't want to be the best in the world. We want to be the best for the world. And I love that so much. I wanted to share that with all of you today because each of you as an educator is doing great work for the world. So thank you for the work that you do in being the best for the world. All right. Well, I think we've explored all of our questions here. And thank you all for joining us today. And Ken, thank you for being here with me today. I do want to mention, Ken and I are going to be back together. We're taking it on the road, Ken. We're going to be in another webinar on May 15th talking about the science of reading and protecting that science of reading investment. And that's a webinar that's part of a 4-part series that we're calling Science of Reading 2.0. It's free. Go ahead and register for it here. And again, this Courage to Lead book, we're also going to do a webinar focused on this Courage to Lead book on Thursday, March 20th. So this QR code will take you to the registration page for both of these upcoming events through 95% Group. All right. Thank you again for attending. Ken, I think that's a wrap. Any final words before we adjourn?
No, I don't think so, Laura. The only thing as you were finishing up right there, it just made me think, I think it's also, remember, you don't have to do this alone. Surround yourself with others that are doers that want what's best for students. Get in the trenches and be a part of the effort. Teachers value that, administrators value that, and that's how you can really start to shift and move that pendulum at a much faster pace.
That's perfect words of wisdom to end with today. So thank you very much, Ken. And again, thank all of you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.